The headlights cut through the darkness like knives through black water. Out here, on the endless stretches of American highway that connect nowhere to nothing, truckers see things that don't make it into polite conversation. They see things that make them question whether they should keep driving or pull over and never start the engine again. Tonight, I'm going to share 4 stories that have circulated through truck stops, CB radios, and hushed conversations at rest areas across this country. Stories that make even the most hardened drivers check their locks twice before settling in for the night. These aren't urban legends passed around a campfire. These are accounts from real people who haul freight across the arteries of America, who spend more time on the road than they do at home, who know that the highways hold secrets that most people will never encounter. Before we begin, ask yourself this. When you ride driving alone at night and you see a truck pulled over on the shoulder with no lights on, do you ever wonder what's happening inside that cab? Do you ever think about what the driver might be running from? Or worse, what might be running toward them? The first story takes us to Interstate 40, that great ribbon of asphalt stretching from California to North Carolina. A driver named Marcus Thompson had been hauling refrigerated goods for nearly 2 decades when he encountered something that made him seriously consider leaving the industry altogether. It was October of 2018, and Marcus was making a routine run from Oklahoma City to Little Rock. The stretch of I-40 through the Ozark Mountains is lonely enough during the day, but at 3 in the morning, it becomes something else entirely. The kind of darkness that seems to have weight pressing against your windows, making every shadow a potential threat. Marcus had just passed through Ozark, Arkansas, when he noticed a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway. This wasn't unusual in itself. Truckers often encounter stranded motorists, hitchhikers, or people who've made poor decisions. But something about this figure struck Marcus as wrong from the moment his headlights illuminated it. The person, if you could call it that, stood perfectly still, facing the traffic. Most people in distress waved their arms, show some sign of needing help. This figure simply stood there, arms at its sides, watching the trucks pass by. Marcus told other drivers later that he couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. The figure wore what looked like dark clothing, but the proportions seemed off somehow, like looking at a person through a distorted lens. Against his better judgment, Marcus slowed down. Perhaps it was the decades of helping stranded motorists, or perhaps it was simple human curiosity. But he pulled his rig onto the shoulder about 100 yards past the figure. He grabbed his flashlight, checked his CB radio to make sure it was working, and stepped out into the cold October night. The temperature had dropped significantly, his breath forming clouds in the beam of his flashlight. He called out, asking if the person needed help. No response. The figure remained motionless, still facing the highway. Marcus called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. He began walking toward the figure, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As he got closer, perhaps 50 feet away, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The figure wasn't breathing. Marcus could see his own breath in the frigid air, could see the condensation from his mouth with each exhale. But from the figure, nothing. No visible breath, no movement of the chest, nothing that would indicate a living person standing in the freezing night. He stopped walking. Every instinct he had developed over 20 years of night driving was screaming at him to turn around and get back in his truck. But before he could move, the figure's head rotated toward him. Not the whole body, just the head, turning in a way that seemed to exceed the normal range of human motion, rotating until it faced him directly. Marcus ran. He didn't care about looking foolish, didn't care about abandoning someone who might genuinely need help. He ran back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and locked every door. His hands shook as he reached for the CB radio, intending to call for help or at least warn other drivers. But before he could key the microphone, he heard something that nearly stopped his heart. A knock on the passenger side door. Slow, deliberate, 3 distinct knocks. Marcus didn't want to look. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to start the engine and drive away. But human nature is curious. even when it shouldn't be. He turned his head toward the passenger window. The figure stood there, pressed against the glass, its face inches from the window. Marcus could see details now that he wished he couldn't. The face was pale, almost luminescent in the darkness, with features that seemed almost normal but not quite right. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, the proportions just slightly off in a way that triggered every primal fear response evolution had built into his brain. This was the uncanny valley made flesh, something that looked almost human, but fundamentally wasn't. The figure raised one hand and placed it against the window. Marcus noticed the fingers were too long, each one seeming to have an extra joint. Then it smiled. That smile is what haunts Marcus to this day. It stretched too wide, revealing too many teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous, filling a mouth that opened far wider than human anatomy should allow. The figure knocked again, same slow, deliberate pattern. 3 knocks. Marcus didn't wait to see what would happen if he didn't respond. He threw the truck into gear and pulled back onto the highway, tires squealing, not caring about the proper procedure for merging a 40-ton vehicle into traffic. He drove for 3 hours straight without stopping, didn't slow down until he reached Little Rock, didn't feel safe until he was surrounded by lights and people and the familiar sounds of civilization. He reported the incident to the Arkansas State Police, but when they investigated, they found nothing on that stretch of highway. No footprints in the gravel, no sign that anyone had been standing on that shoulder. Marcus is the only driver to report strange encounters on that particular stretch of I-40 through the Ozarks. A phenomenon that truckers have started calling the Ozark Watcher has been reported at least a dozen times over the past 5 years. Always the same description: a figure standing motionless on the shoulder, always between mile markers 100 and 110, always in the early morning hours between 2 and 4 a.m. Some drivers who've encountered it report the same details Marcus did: the inhuman proportions, the impossible smile, the fingers with too many joints. Others report variations. One driver swears the figure had no face at all, just smooth skin where features should have been. Another claimed the figure seemed to be wearing the face of someone else, like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. Here is a disturbing fact that researchers have uncovered: that stretch of highway has an unusually high rate of single vehicle accidents involving trucks. Drivers who simply veer off the road for no apparent reason, often with no skid marks, no signs of braking, as if they deliberately drove into the darkness. In 2016 alone, there were 7 such accidents in the 10-mile stretch. Statistical analysis shows this is roughly 4 times higher than the national average for similar highway segments. When investigators interview the survivors, many report seeing something on the shoulder just before the accident, though their descriptions are often dismissed as hallucinations brought on by fatigue. But ask yourself this: if you were driving alone at night and saw something that defied explanation, something that made you question reality itself, would you trust your own eyes? Or would you convince yourself it was exhaustion, a trick of the light, anything other than accepting that something impossible had just happened? The second story comes from the desert Southwest, specifically a stretch of Interstate 10 between Phoenix and Tucson. The Sonoran Desert is beautiful during the day, but at night it becomes an alien landscape of shadows and strange sounds. A driver named Sarah Mitchell learned just how alien it could be. During a run in July of 2019, Sarah had been driving trucks for 8 years, mostly regional routes in Arizona and New Mexico. She prided herself on being practical, level-headed, not given the flights of fancy or superstition. She laughed at the stories other drivers told about ghost hitchhikers and phantom vehicles. That confidence was shattered on a night when the temperature still hovered above 90 degrees. Even though it was well past midnight, Sarah was hauling automotive parts from Phoenix to Tucson, a route she'd driven hundreds of times. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional car or truck passing in the opposite direction. She had her CB radio on, listening to the scattered chatter of other drivers, when she noticed headlights in her mirror. A vehicle was approaching fast from behind, faster than was safe or legal on this stretch of highway. Sarah moved into the right lane to let it pass, expecting to see some teenager in a sports car or maybe a drunk driver weaving between lanes. Instead, what passed her was a truck, an old truck from the look of it. She caught a glimpse as it went by, a semi that looked like it dated from the 1970s or early 80s, the kind with a long hood and round headlights, painted in a faded color she couldn't quite identify in the darkness. The strange thing was, Sarah could see into the cab as it passed. It was empty. No driver behind the wheel, no one in the passenger seat, just an empty cab with the interior lights on, cruising down the highway at what must have been 90 miles per hour. Sarah keyed her CB microphone, calling out to any other drivers in range. Did anyone else see that? Did anyone else just watch a driverless truck blow past them? Static answered her, punctuated by silence. She tried again, adjusting frequencies, but got nothing. Her radio seemed to be working fine, but no one was responding. The empty truck ahead of her began to slow down. Sarah watched as it gradually matched her speed, staying about a quarter mile ahead of her. Then it did something that made Sarah's hands tighten on the wheel. It drifted into the left lane, as if whoever wasn't driving it had turned the wheel, and began a slow U-turn across the median. There was no traffic coming from the opposite direction. Nothing to make this maneuver necessary or logical. The truck completed its turn and was now heading back toward her, driving the wrong way down the highway, its headlights growing brighter as it approached. Sarah laid on her horn, flashed her lights, did everything she could to signal that this impossible truck needed to get out of her lane. It kept coming, closing the distance at a combined speed of over 100 miles per hour. At the last possible second, Sarah jerked her wheel to the right, pulling her truck onto the shoulder, and a maneuver that would have earned her a serious citation from any observing highway patrol officer. The phantom truck roared past her, close enough that she could feel the wind of its passage rock her vehicle. In the split second it took to pass, Sarah looked up into the cab. This time, it wasn't empty. Someone or something sat in the driver's seat. She couldn't make out details, couldn't see a face or features, just a dark shape that seemed to turn its head toward her as it passed. Then the truck was behind her, and when Sarah checked her mirrors, it was gone. Not driving away, not disappearing into the distance, just gone, as if it had never existed. Sarah pulled to a complete stop on the shoulder, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short gasps. She sat there for 10 minutes, trying to process what she'd just experienced, trying to find a rational explanation for what she'd seen. She couldn't. There was no rational explanation for a driverless truck, no way to account for a vehicle that could vanish into thin air. She grabbed her phone, intending to call the highway patrol, but she had no signal. Out here in the desert, cell coverage was spotty at best. She considered waiting for another truck to pass, flagging them down to verify that she wasn't losing her mind. But the highway remained empty. Not a single vehicle passed in either direction for the entire time she sat there. Eventually, she started her engine and continued toward Tucson, checking her mirrors constantly, jumping at every shadow. When she arrived at her destination, she asked around at the truck stop, carefully describing what she'd seen without making herself sound crazy. One of the older drivers, a man who'd been hauling freight through Arizona for 30 years, nodded slowly. He told her about the ghost hauler of Interstate 10. According to truck stop legend, sometime in the early 1980s, a driver had died behind the wheel on this exact stretch of highway. Heart attack, stroke, nobody knows for sure. What they do know is that his truck kept going in automatic transmission and gear cruise control engaged, rolling down the highway with a dead man at the wheel until it finally drifted off the road and crashed into a ravine. They found the driver's body weeks later, mummified by the desert heat. Since then, drivers have reported seeing an old truck, always in the same area, always behaving impossibly. Sometimes it's empty, sometimes there's a shadow behind the wheel. Some drivers report it pacing them for miles, matching their speed exactly, before vanishing. Others say it tries to run them off the road, as if whatever drives it is angry at the living for still being able to drive while it is trapped in eternal motion. Sarah isn't sure she believes in ghosts, but she knows what she saw. She still drives the route, but she does it during the day now, and she always makes sure she's not alone on that stretch of highway at night. Here is something that should make you think. Arizona Department of Transportation records show an unusual pattern of reported driverless vehicles on I-10 between Phoenix and Tucson. Over the past 15 years, there have been 43 separate reports to highway patrol of trucks or cars traveling with no visible driver. Investigation of these reports has never found any vehicles matching the descriptions. Never found any evidence of such vehicles existing. Skeptics say it's heat mirages, fatigue, the human brain trying to make sense of shadows and distance. But 43 reports following the same pattern, describing the same impossible thing. From drivers who've never met each other and had no way to coordinate their stories. That's harder to dismiss. The third story takes us to the northern plains, specifically Interstate 94 through North Dakota. This is tornado country, where the weather can turn from beautiful to lethal in minutes. A driver named George Rodriguez was making a run from Fargo to Bismarck in June of 2020, when he encountered something that made a tornado seem almost preferable. The weather that evening was unstable, with severe thunderstorm warnings and tornado watches covering the entire region. George had considered pulling over to wait out the storms, but his delivery schedule was tight, and he'd driven through bad weather before. He figured he could outrun the worst of it, or at least stay ahead of any developing tornadoes. The rain started around 8 p.m., a steady downpour that reduced visibility to maybe 100 feet. George slowed down, turned on his flashers, and kept going. The highway was mostly empty, which wasn't surprising given the weather warnings. Every few minutes, his CB radio crackled with updates from other drivers, reports of where the storms were worst, which exits to avoid. George was approaching the town of Jamestown when he saw the lights. At first, he thought it was another truck, maybe someone else crazy enough to be out in this weather. But as he got closer, he realized the lights were wrong. Too many of them, arranged in a pattern that didn't match any vehicle he'd ever seen. The lights were stretched across the highway, blocking both lanes. Pulsing in a rhythm that made George's head ache, he slowed down, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. As he got within 100 yards, the rain suddenly stopped. Not gradually, not easing off, but stopping instantly as if someone had turned off a faucet. The silence was profound, broken only by the rumble of his engine and the splash of water under his tires. The lights brightened, and George could see that they weren't attached to any vehicle. They were just there, hanging in the air. Impossibly bright points of light arranged in a geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. His CB radio erupted with static, a harsh shriek that made him reach for the volume knob. But before he could turn it down, voices came through. Not the usual chatter of drivers, not anything that sounded human. These were voices speaking in harmony, all saying the same words in a language George didn't recognize. The temperature inside his cab began to drop, his breath visible in the air despite it being June and despite the fact that his heater had been running. The lights began to move, drifting apart and then coming back together in a different configuration, like a kaleidoscope made of stars. George did what any sane person would do. He stopped his truck, put it in park, and sat frozen in his seat, unable to process what was happening. The lights moved toward his truck, surrounding it, and George felt a sensation he'd never experienced before and can't adequately describe. He says it felt like his entire being was being examined, like something was looking through him, seeing every memory, every thought, every secret he'd ever kept. The sensation wasn't painful exactly, but it was deeply uncomfortable, invasive in a way that made him want to scream, but couldn't because his vocal cords wouldn't respond. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the rain started again. The lights vanished, all at once, leaving him alone on the dark highway with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. As CB radio crackled back to normal, drivers discussing the storm, asking if anyone had seen the funnel cloud that had been reported near Jamestown. George grabbed the microphone and tried to ask if anyone else had seen the lights, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again, describing what he'd just experienced. The other drivers went silent. Then, after a long pause, one driver, an older man by the sound of his voice, said something that George will never forget. "Son, if you saw the lights, you weren't meant to talk about them. Best to keep that to yourself and be grateful they let you go." George didn't understand what the driver meant, but something in the man's tone made him decide not to press the issue. He put his truck in gear and continued toward Bismarck, glancing at his mirrors every few seconds, half expecting the lights to reappear. They didn't. He completed his delivery without further incident. But when he checked his dashboard clock, he realized something was wrong. The trip from where he'd encountered the lights to Bismarck should have taken about an hour and a half. According to his clock, it had taken 4 hours. He'd lost 2.5 hours somewhere between Jamestown and Bismarck, time that simply vanished with no memory of where it went. George tried to file a report about the lights, but he didn't know what to report or who to report it to. The police. They think he was crazy or on drugs. The FAA. The lights hadn't been in the sky. They'd been on the highway. He eventually found an online community of people who'd experienced similar things, though most of them were reluctant to share details. What he learned disturbed him more than the experience itself. The lights have been reported on highways across the Plain States for decades, always during severe weather, always accompanied by lost time and the sensation of being examined or studied. Some researchers believe there's some form of atmospheric phenomenon, ball lightning or plasma formations created by the unique electrical conditions of severe thunderstorms. But ball lightning doesn't stop rain mid-fall, doesn't arrange itself in geometric patterns, and doesn't cause people to lose hours of time. Others believe something else is using the storms as cover, appearing during weather events when most people are indoors and the highways are empty. Something that watches, studies, examines the people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. George doesn't know what to believe. He knows what he experienced, knows that he lost time he can't account for, knows that sometimes late at night he'll wake up with the certainty that he's being watched, being studied, being remembered by something that shouldn't exist. He still drives trucks, still hauls freight across North Dakota, but he never, ever drives during severe weather anymore. And when other drivers ask him why, he just says he learned his lesson about respecting the weather. The fourth and final story is perhaps the most disturbing, because it doesn't involve the supernatural or the impossible. It involves something much more frightening: other people. This story comes from a driver named Robert Chin, who was making a run through rural Kentucky in March of 2021. Robert had been driving for 5 years, mostly long-haul routes through the Appalachian region. He had hauled everything from furniture to electronics, and he prided himself on being able to handle whatever the road threw at him. But nothing prepared him for what he encountered on a service road outside of a town called Pine Hollow. Robert's GPS had routed him off the main highway onto what it claimed was a shortcut. This wasn't unusual. GPS systems often found routes that shaved 10 or 15 minutes off a trip. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for his truck, winding through dense forest with no streetlights and no houses. Robert had been following this road for about 20 minutes when he saw a car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. A woman stood next to the car, waving her arms, clearly in distress. Robert's first instinct was to help. He'd been that person before, stranded on the side of the road, hoping someone would stop. He pulled his truck over about 50 yards past the car and climbed out of the cab. The woman approached him quickly, talking rapidly about how her car had broken down, how her phone had no signal, how she'd been stranded for hours. She was young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in jeans and a jacket, nothing that seemed out of place. Robert told her he could give her a ride to the nearest town or call for a tow truck. Once they got back to an area with cell service, the woman thanked him profusely and headed toward the passenger side of his truck. That's when Robert noticed the car. He'd assumed it was broken down, but as he got a better look, he realized the engine was still running. He could see the exhaust coming from the tailpipe, could hear the rumble of the idling engine. Before he could process this inconsistency, the woman opened his passenger door, but she didn't climb in. Instead, she stepped to the side, and 3 men emerged from the darkness behind his truck. They moved fast, surrounding him before he could react. One of them held a tire iron. Another had what looked like a crowbar. The third man, the largest of the group, smiled at Robert and said, "We appreciate you stopping. Real kind of you. Now, you're going to give us the keys to your truck, and we're going to take whatever you're hauling. You're going to stand here and count to 1,000, and if we see you move before then, things are going to get unpleasant." Robert wasn't a fighter. He was a 52-year-old man who drove a truck for a living. He handed over his keys. The men, along with the woman who'd flagged him down, climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving Robert standing on a dark road in rural Kentucky with no phone, no vehicle, and no way to call for help. He started walking, following the road in the direction he'd been heading, hoping to find a house or at least a place with cell signal. After about an hour of walking, he saw lights through the trees. A house, small and run down, but with lights on inside. Robert knocked on the door, and an elderly man answered, eyeing him suspiciously. Robert explained what had happened, asked to use the man's phone to call the police. The elderly man's expression changed from suspicion to something Robert couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or resignation. The man led him inside and handed him a phone. While Robert called the local sheriff's department, the man told him something that made his blood run cold. "You're the third driver they've gotten this month. Always the same spot on that road. Always the same story. Woman with car trouble. Men come out of nowhere. Local police know about it, but they can't seem to catch them. That road, it's not on most maps. The people doing this, they know how to work the GPS systems, know how to route trucks through here. It's a trap, and drivers keep falling for it." The sheriff arrived about 45 minutes later, took Robert's statement, but didn't seem particularly optimistic about recovering his truck or catching the people responsible. "They're probably 3 states away by now," the sheriff said. "These crews, they're professional. They know how to strip a truck and sell the cargo before anyone can track them. We've got descriptions, we've got reports, but we don't have much else." Robert's truck was found 2 weeks later in a field outside of Nashville, completely stripped. Everything he'd been hauling was gone, along with anything of value from the truck itself. The insurance covered some of it, but not all. More than the financial loss, though, was the psychological impact. Robert had trusted his instincts, had thought he was helping someone in need, and had walked directly into a trap. This is the story that should frighten you the most because it's the most real. There are no ghosts, no impossible lights, no unexplained phenomena. Just people exploiting the better nature of others, using the isolation of rural highways to prey on truck drivers. The FBI estimates that cargo theft costs the trucking industry billions of dollars annually, and a significant portion of that comes from what they call highway takeovers, incidents, where drivers are forced to surrender their vehicles through threat or deception. Many of these incidents go unreported because drivers are embarrassed that they fell for the scam, or because they fear retribution from the criminals involved. Robert still drives trucks, but he's changed his approach. He doesn't stop for stranded motorists anymore, no matter how much his conscience tells him he should. He calls the local authorities and reports the location, but he doesn't stop. He's installed cameras in his cab, carries pepper spray, and never, ever follows GPS routes that take him off main highways. He's also joined an online community of drivers who share information about known hijacking spots. about roads to avoid, about tactics these criminal crews use. It's a different kind of horror than the other stories, but in some ways it's worse because it's preventable. Every driver who gets robbed did so because they tried to help, because they trusted their fellow humans, because they believe that people in need deserve assistance. These four stories represent different facets of the American highway experience. The supernatural, encounters that defy explanation, the unexplained phenomena that might be natural or might be something else entirely, and the very human monsters who exploit the isolation and vulnerability of drivers, just trying to do their jobs. Across the millions of miles of American highways, trucks roll day and night, moving the goods that keep this country functioning. The drivers of those trucks see things, experience things, encounter things that most people never will. Some of them share their stories, trying to warn others or simply to process what they've experienced. Others keep quiet, not wanting to be labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. But the stories persist, passed along through CB radio conversations, shared in truck stop diners, posted in online forums. The Ozark Watcher continues to appear on Interstate 40. The ghost hauler still races through the Arizona desert. The lights still emerge during storms on the northern plains, and criminal crews still set traps for unsuspecting drivers on isolated roads. If you ever find yourself driving at night on a lonely highway, pay attention to what you see. That truck pulled over with no lights might have a driver experiencing something they can't explain. That figure on the shoulder might be something that shouldn't exist. That stranded motorist might be exactly what they appear to be, or they might be bait in a trap. The highways of America are more than just concrete and asphalt. They're places where the normal rules seem suspended, where the impossible becomes possible, where the line between our world and whatever else might exist grows thin. Truck drivers know this. They've learned it through experience, through stories shared, through encounters that change how they see the world. The next time you pass a truck on the highway, remember that the person behind the wheel might have seen things you couldn't imagine, might be carrying memories of encounters that would make you question reality itself. And if you're ever the one behind the wheel, driving through the darkness, and you see something that doesn't make sense, something that can't be explained, remember these stories. Remember that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. Others have seen it too, have lived through it, have survived to tell the tale. And whatever you do, keep your doors locked. Trust your instincts, and never, ever assume that what you see on the highway is all that's really there.